Hello, global gardeners. Had some technical difficulties today. I think I have them fixed. Please let me know in the comments here at the beginning if you can hear me okay and see me okay. I'm at my backup location. It's great to see everybody here today, and I hope I'm going out. It looks like I'm going out on my side, so please let me know that everything's looking okay. One of those hectic mornings where I just wanted to get on and do things like I've always done, answer your questions, and then suddenly the camera doesn't work and things aren't looking the way they're supposed to be looking. So, too much echo. Okay, so I think we might just have to deal with that as much as possible. Let me see if I can get back into it. I'm operating from my dining room, and so there is a lot of echo in this room, which could be a problem. So bear with me if you can. If it gets too difficult, we may just have to stop early. But I am glad that I'm here. The audio is wacky. I'm trying to use this little bit of a microphone. Don't know what went wrong. It's just one of those things that you hope for the best, and then it doesn't turn out the way that you hope. But that's what gardening is all about on a daily basis for most of us. So I'm just going to press forward. And it's great having you all here today. I do apologize that I don't have the good video and the good sound that we've been used to for the last year. But this is the way I started a year ago. In this room, I can hear the echo myself. So I appreciate all your efforts and how far we've come in the last year. And now we'll have the chance to go ahead and fix some stuff. So it looks like we might have some double audio. Let me try this thing real quick, see if this works. And so how is that? So I've taken away one of the audio sources. Has that cut down on the echo a little bit? If that is, then I don't need the headphones. That's what I tried taking off. So appreciate your feedback, appreciate your patience as we move forward in the day. So removing that, that's better. Okay, good. Then let's go with that. I was hoping that the headset microphone might benefit a little bit. This is the computer microphone. So if you like that better and there's less echo, we're going to move forward. So anyway, we're here. It took us, what was that, 3 minutes, almost 4 minutes to get on track, but we're here. I know some of you are listening from your greenhouse today. Some of you are probably watching on replay, so thanks for sticking with us as the technical difficulties are being resolved. Okay, and I do want to start off. Rachel McGraw actually raised a good point, asked me to do a little public service announcement about bird feeders. And I'm working on a video right now about building bird houses, and I'll be talking about attracting birds and feeding the birds in the months ahead. But that's a very good point. If you have bird houses and or bird feeders, springtime is when you want to start throwing in seed and you want to start thinking about attracting the hummingbirds with sugar water, but you shouldn't go forward with what you, excuse me, what you had last year. You should clean all of your materials. If you've got a birdhouse, and I'll show you that in my design when I have that video where I have one of the walls that can actually be lowered to clean the inside of the birdhouse. It's for the health of the birds, both with the seed that they might be eating. You don't want contaminated seed that has mold or something growing on it because you've put it in a contaminated feeder. You don't want them building their nest in a contaminated birdhouse. They might not even eat the seed or use the birdhouse if they determine that it's too messy and too dirty. So if you are one of those that wants to attract the birds and you're doing something along those lines, clean it. Clean the feeder, clean the house, make sure you're using fresh, clean seed, and then hopefully you'll have some good results moving forward in the season. So there you go, Rachel. I think that was a good point. I'm glad that you asked me to raise that. PD's saying, how do the box stores get their tomato plant stems and leaves so thick? Do they use some type of amendment? My seedlings are doing great, but don't look like the big box stores. There's a few things that they do. Some of it is how they grow, how they do the lights, how they do the soil, how they do the fertilizer, and a lot of it is air circulation as well. We've talked a little bit about this in the past, But if you regularly put a fan on your seedlings, or like what I'll do is I'll just brush the top of my tomato seedlings and peppers. By disrupting the stem, you will actually force it to grow thicker. And so I know some greenhouses do that where they have fans growing continuously, and then they have the really bright lights. So the really bright lights and a nutrient-rich soil and some type of airflow or brushing on the stems should give you a sturdier stem. Now, particularly with tomatoes, I don't worry too much about that because I'm going to be burying much of the stem through the growing process, and when I put my tomatoes outside, I'll be burying the stem as well. And then when the plant takes off in the sun, with that full sun and the wind blowing, you'll get the tomato plants that you're used to, nice and sturdy plants. But you can do an artificial movement in your own grow operation and see if that helps a little bit. You might notice a difference. Okay, let's see what we have popping up. Chris is saying, I think I have damping off. My seedlings got a little black around dirt level, and they got starchy. I'm not sure what that is. Does that sound right? And so it's possible. Yeah, there are a number of fungal diseases, and we'll typically say damping off disease, and that may incorporate a half a dozen different types of fungi that could cause a disease. It could be the problem. And so if you know that your grow area is humid, if the soil is staying wet, and you start noticing that your little seedlings are dying, and particularly right at the soil level, if you notice they're discolored, if they're thinner than the rest of the stem, that's usually a fungal disease. And drying out the surface of the soil can help. So this is a time when you get to the bottom watering. And then also cinnamon has antifungal properties, and that's one of the things I know some of you have done is to sprinkle cinnamon on the surface, allow that surface to dry out a little bit, bottom water, and then hopefully you'll relieve that issue. But once you've got that fungal problem, you probably have spores in place and the fungus is just waiting to grow again. So you really have to stay on top of it to keep it from coming back. Once the seedlings reach a certain size, usually 3 or 4 true leaves and the stem is thicker, those fungal diseases aren't going to have as big an impact anymore. You just got to get them past that initial seedling phase, and that's usually when things turn out better. So hope that help out for you, Chris, and we'll see if maybe you can get some better results with your seedlings as they emerge. So, okay, let's see what we have. Ashley is saying, there's green algae on top of my seedlings and have a fan on them. Is this a problem? Not usually. And so if you're using a peat moss based mix, which many of us do, well, the peat moss is coming from a bog, and that bog has a lot of algae-like plants. And so what it means is that your peat is nice and moist, and some of the little spores of the seedlings or some of the dead plants that might have hitched a ride on that peat, now they're starting to grow again. And that's all the algae is. It's just a type of plant. So I don't concern myself too much with algae, and especially when I use the peat pellets, I have some algae issues, and it's no big deal. The plants will grow right through it. It's kind of like a ground cover, and it's not going to absorb the nutrients that the plant is going to need. And even at the end of the season, if I got peat pellets where the seeds didn't germinate, but yet because I kept it nice and moist and humid, that algae developed, I'll go ahead and take that peat and add it to my mix for the next year. It's that little of a concern for me. So again, you can try letting the surface dry out, and that can relieve the concern a little bit. But unlike the fungus, the algae doesn't really pose much of a problem. So Laura Lasby, welcome to the Garden Training membership. Good to have you here today, and thanks for doing that. I appreciate it. Melissa Fallon, I just saw a question. Let me scroll back up if I can because it just disappeared real quickly. I'm in Central Texas. What is the best percent of shade cloth for our hot climate when it hits 100 degrees? Should I buy 1% or should I have two different levels of percentage? I would say try a couple different types. And so most of the shade cloth I use is a 50% or a 60% shade cloth. And you can get everything from a 20% to an 80%, just depending on how much you want to block out. And so I'll use a lower percentage, basically less shade, earlier in the season, like end of spring, beginning of summer, because I'm more concerned about hail and thunderstorms. And so I'll put a shade cloth over when it starts getting that hot, partly to shade the plants, but also as a hail protector. But in the season, when I've got temperatures approaching 100 degrees regularly, then I'll go to a higher percentage shade cloth, depending on the plant. Now, peppers can handle a lot more sun than tomatoes can, and tomatoes can handle a lot more sun than spinach and lettuce. So it really does depend on the plants you're growing and how much shade you want on them. And so those warm season plants that can handle some heat in the summer, I'll use a lower percentage of shade. And for those cool season plants that I'm trying to grow as long as possible, I'll use a higher percentage of shade. And so, yeah, I do have a couple different kinds just depending on the time of year and what kind of plant I'm growing. And so you might want to start off with like a 50 or 60% and see what kind of results you have. But also check with other experienced gardeners in your area and see if they have a preference based on how much sun you get and the plants you're growing. That might help a little bit. So, okay, let's see what we have popping up. So good to see everybody here today. And once again, if you're checking in late, I apologize for my backup location, but my primary camera went kaput today for some reason. So had to do a last minute, very quick reaction, and that's why we're here today. Sounds a little bit different, pictures a little bit different, but we're here. We can talk gardening as we move through the rest of the season. And I saw somebody early on, since I wanted to talk today about false spraying, and I'll get more into that in a little bit. And that's just a term. I'm not talking about an entire season as being false or trying to figure out massive temperature changes over the course of the year, but just the basic concept of what happens when you have a situation like I have right now. It is going to be hot, hot, hot today. Yesterday, we set a record high temperature. Today, we're going to set a record high temperature. I went out and put some seeds in the ground yesterday, but I know that my spring really hasn't arrived yet because I'm more than actually more like 6 weeks away from the last frost date, but 2 weeks early for some of the things that I'm actually putting outside. And so we'll get much more into depth about that here in just a little bit. Keep throwing your questions at me as we start talking about spring in general and putting plants outside and transplanting. Those are the general themes that I wanted to try to touch on today. So Barbara Grace, hello from West Michigan. Good to see you from Michigan. Got a drenching thunderstorm. Those thunderstorms are definitely coming for me, and I wish we could get some. It's been so hot and dry, I actually had to water my garden yesterday, and that's another thing I'll be talking about here in a little bit. Ancient Gardening is saying, we appreciate the warm days, even if there will be frost later. Our last frost is mid-May, and we need stuff in the ground by May 1st. And that's exactly the concept is, if we have a mid-May last frost like I do, and we typically get plants in the ground around May 1st, which I often do, and now the first week of April, we're having days that are 80 degrees Fahrenheit. It is very tempting to want to get out there and put our plants in the ground. And especially for new gardeners that are new to an area, you see those kind of situations where, hey, it's sunny out, the stores are starting to put some of their plants for sale. I'm going to start my garden. Well, in my case, It's 6 weeks, if not 2 months early for some of the things that we need to grow. So be careful about that. Go ahead and start sharing some of your experiences, and we'll be talking about it. Mrs. Marvel says, my toddler hunted plastic eggs over the weekend because it was just too hot for boiled eggs. Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of us that are undergoing these warm temperatures right now. And you do modify things like Easter. If you're going to modify the type of eggs you hunt for Easter, you need to modify how you garden. Kevin's saying our last frost date was March 27th, and a lot of Georgians jumped on it. Of course, we had a late freeze on Easter as usual. Now we can plant. A lot of people caved to temptation. Good point, Kevin. And that's one of the points I wanted to make today as well, is you get tempted by the good weather. You get tempted by the warmth, and you want to jump on it, and you want to get plants in the ground. It is so much better to just stick with your plan as much as possible, based on your experience with weather, your experience with the climate you have, and talking with other gardeners in the area. So especially if you're a new gardener, don't be tempted to jump the gun and put plants in too early, because you might have the results like Kevin says. If you know on Easter you get a freeze, and it's very normal for us to have freezes on Easter, then you know not to put in till after the last frost date, and in that case, after Easter. In my case, it's usually Mother's Day in May is a date that a lot of locals use. That's after our last frost date, but it's one of those safe points that in most years, if you wait that extra week or so, you'll have better success, and you will avoid some of those late season freezes. So let's see, it looks like Curie has checked on. I didn't see Curie checking on, but I see Linda talking to Curie. Last year I planted peas for the first time. I direct sowed and couldn't figure out why there were a few coming up. Finally learned that the voles were probably eating them. Interesting. And so that's one of those things, again, with learning your own garden and the things that are impacting your plants. It might not be all weather related. I haven't seen the evidence of the voles and gophers yet, but my soil is beginning to thaw, and so I know they're getting ready, and they're going to be out there soon. And if it's the springtime that you start having some of those pests show up, then you need to adjust how you put your seeds and your plants in the ground. So that's interesting that you've learned to put plants in rather than some seeds in because of voles. And that's one of the reasons I grow in raised beds, because I don't have the problem with the voles in the raised beds, because I've got the wire and mesh at the bottom of the bed. So, okay, let's see. You guys are just throwing stuff out there and it's moving fast. Kay Russell saying, does this pertain to flower bulbs as well? I have lilies. Let's see, I can plant from March to June, the same hardiness zone as you. And so bulbs are different than seeds. And so when you put bulbs in the ground, you can put the bulbs in the ground and a frost comes, and it's usually not going to be an issue. So if you've got spring planted bulbs, then as soon as the soil can be worked usually, and they'll give you that range of April to June or March to May, depending on your zone, you can go ahead and put the bulbs in the ground. And when the soil temperature is right, those bulbs will warm up and the plants will emerge, and usually it's okay past that point. So do follow the recommendation based on your zone and what bulbs you're trying to grow, what the flowers happen to be. Seeds are a little more finicky because they usually are more dependent on the soil temperature and the conditions, and depending on the type of plant. If you're trying to grow a warm season vegetable and a freeze hits, it's going to kill the plant. So you do have to be a little more selective at the time of year that you do your seeds. And this is another one of those things that I want to talk about, so let's get to it now, is soil temperature. How many of you have actually measured your soil temperature this spring at all? Have you gone out with a meat probe or a garden thermometer and actually measured your soil temperature? Because it might be surprising. And so I did that this week, with temperatures most of the week in the high 70s Fahrenheit, which is quite warm. And my soil temperature It's actually about 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So as warm as the days have been, it takes a while for the soil to thaw and warm out. And so you may want to get your seeds in, and it looks like the weather's great. The climate seems to support your choice of plant and when you put them in. But if your soil hasn't warmed up yet, then you might not get germination. And this is one of those issues, especially if you got something like voles. If you're putting seeds in and they're going to be slow to germinate because the soil temperature hasn't warmed up yet, then you're more likely to lose some of those seeds to voles and to mice and to birds and to insects, as those seeds may actually rot before they germinate. So check your soil temperature. And I was looking at some of my seed packages. Botanical Interest is a great company. Their seed packets are just spectacular. And so on their seed package, they actually suggest the temperature, soil temperature, for best germination. And so I put in some lettuces and some salad crops, knowing my soil temperature ranges from 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit based on which bed I'm putting them in. And the recommendation is 60 degrees Fahrenheit for the best germination. So I know I'm putting my seeds into soil that isn't warm enough yet, but that's okay because I'm going to cover that bed with plastic, which should boost those temperatures and help that soil warm up now that I've got the seeds in place. So if your seeds are slow to germinate, and if you jump the gun and you're trying to grow things right now, and it may be a little too early for your area, it could be the soil temperature. So get out there and measure. And that's one of those things you can stick in your garden journal and track from year to year. How early does your soil thaw out? And how early does it reach a temperature like 60 degrees Fahrenheit, at which point you can sow most of your cool weather plants and expect pretty quick germination. So those little extras, I think, are what make the difference. As a beginning gardener, most of us don't even think about those kind of things. But as you get more experienced, that's what makes the difference. And you might get an extra week or two in your growing season by measuring your soil temperatures and sowing your seeds accordingly. So add that to your bag of tricks. Ancient Gardening saying, we were surprised that the carrot seeds we direct sown a year ago are coming up now in a rainy, warm spring. And so there's a lot of biennial plants like that. The carrots are just one of them. The root has lots of energy. It's just waiting to grow, and it can handle cold conditions. And so as soon as the soil warms up enough that it wakes up that carrot root, yep, sure enough, it's going to start growing. And now this season, you'll be able to see the carrot flowers and save that carrot seed for the future. So I love watching the carrots pop up in the garden. It's almost like seeing a perennial plant and start to grow. And I've noticed a lot of that in my garden, that the perennial plants are starting to wake up, the grasses are starting to wake up. It's really nice. I love this time of year when it does warm up. But in my vegetable garden, it's still too early. Still too early for me to get some of my stuff. And if you're in Georgia like Kevin, your cold season crops may have already bolted with the warm weather. So again, you got to figure out for yourself when the time is right to get the best results from your plants. Omar Santos, thank you so much for that contribution and that thumbs up. I appreciate it. Thanks for being here today. Thanks for listening, and thanks for that contribution. That's great. Mrs. Marvel down in Arizona also had problems with bolting. And so and that's what makes gardening so great, is we are a global blend of gardeners. I'm talking about being a few weeks before I can do most of my cool season plants, and we already have those of you that have put them in and they're bolting, and now you can start thinking about collecting seeds before some of us have even put in seeds. But gardening is gardening, and we're all going to do the same thing. We're just doing it at a different rate, different time of year, and so the same lessons hold true. Rose Buffalo, hello, another one from Arizona. Good to have you here today. John Johnson is saying they bolted and became chicken feed. That's a good thing to do with your greens, and I'll do that with my neighbor's chickens. If I have some extra greens, not a lot that I'm going to put into the compost pile. I'm weeding and thinning out some plants. I'll throw them across to the chickens. Chickens love that. And my neighbor actually gave me a nice clutch of fresh eggs the other day. So anything I can do to help out the chickens. And he told me he's going to have some chicken manure as he cleans out the coop here pretty soon. And so I'll be adding that to my compost pile. So that's good. Jenny Simon saying, I dislike perlite in my seed starting mix. Can you do just peat moss and vermiculite? Oh, sure. Yeah, vermiculite and perlite are pretty much interchangeable as far as a potting mix is concerned. And I use them interchangeably. I use perlite more for a seed starter mix, and I use vermiculite more for a potting mix because vermiculite can hold some water. And so as my plants are growing, I want the soil to stay as moist as possible, and that extra little bit of vermiculite absorbing some moisture can help the seedlings a little bit, in my opinion. Whereas, like we were talking about with the damping off disease, we don't want our seeds and seedlings getting too wet, and so drainage is better. And perlite is a little better than vermiculite for drainage, but consider them interchangeable. So if you don't like perlite and you want to use vermiculite, go for it. Yeah, there's absolutely no problem with that. Chris, thank you so much for that contribution. That looks like a Georgia peach. Thank you so much. Always good to see you here every week. Okay, Leroy Jenkins says, we've had a great winter of kale, lettuce, bok choy, and red cabbage in Southern California's high desert. That's awesome. And if you're in a zone 8 or 9 or 10, your definition of winter is much different than my definition of winter as far as our gardens are concerned. And so I've touched on that over the months and as we've done these live streams, but think about that, especially for Arizona and Southern California and Georgia, those areas where you have the early bolting by comparison with the rest of us, because you can be growing all those things during the winter and have a very long season. So I'm glad to hear you had that success, because that's exactly what you should be doing, is growing during the winter. The sun may be lower in the sky and it may take longer for the plants to mature, but I wish I had that option to be able to do that, because, well, I'm looking at snow on the ground. I'd love to be growing some bok choy and harvest it and make a nice stir fry. Melissa Fallon, thank you for that super chat as well. And I like your icon. That's really nice, and thank you for being here. A's Animal saying, what do you think about Epsom salt for container vegetables? And that's a good question. It's a good way to ask the question. I don't think Epsom salts, magnesium sulfate, is needed for most of our raised bed gardening, because most of our soils have enough magnesium and sulfur in it. And so the addition of Epsom salts usually isn't necessary in the larger garden, unless you do a soil test and you realize you might get some benefit from it. But in containers, we are typically growing in a soilless mix. And so it's a potting mix that may be cocoa coir based or peat moss based, and it might have some vermiculite and compost and worm castings. And for the most part, it's a great medium to grow the plants in. But the nutrients are usually deficient unless you add something else. Even if you've got the worm castings and the compost, that may not provide a lot of the minerals that plants need. So in that case, Epsom salts in containers can be beneficial. The problem is you just don't know exactly how much to add and how much the plant will actually absorb. In a typical growing season, where the plants might be in containers for just a few months, you might not get much benefit from the Epsom salts, just because it's not going to break down into the components that plants can actually absorb. That can be a time-consuming process. But in a container where you're going to reuse the soil from year to year, or you've got some plants that are going to stay in there for more than just a few months, you might see some benefits from Epsom salts. And so it's one of those things to give it a try. And then also consider what your plant is doing. Take a look at it. You might also need to add some other types of fertilizers as well. Jay Dixon, thank you so much. You're always on the ball. Thanks for reminding everybody that you can support. Give a thumbs up, join, buy, subscribe, do the Amazon link. We've got all these things to help support the Gardener Scott channel, and it helps me keep cranking out these videos and getting some of the materials that I need. So I do appreciate all your support. And yeah, even just a simple thumbs up is enough to show YouTube that you like the channel and you like the content, and that'll help keep us active in the YouTube world. The more YouTube likes your channel, the more that people will see the channel. And my whole goal is just to spread the word of gardening, get it out to as many people as possible, especially this time of year with a lot of new gardeners that are starting to explore and look for ways to do things. I think you might agree that I've got some good videos for new gardeners, and so I want to keep producing those. So thanks, Jay, and I appreciate the support from all of you as well. So Donald saying, hi, Gardener Scott, love your videos. I planted garlic last year. They're doing well now. Do they need fertilizer up until harvest? Don from Long Island. It depends, Don. So I don't fertilize my garlic, but that's because before I put my garlic in, I take the effort to really amend the soil and have a lot of organic matter. And so you've probably seen some of that. I've got a couple different videos where I talk about garlic, and I've got a couple different videos where I talk about amending, and I reference the different plants I'm doing. And so for my garlic bed, I spend a lot of time getting the soil ready to go. And all that organic matter is enough to provide the nutrients through the season of growing, the 9 months that the garlic is in the ground. So if you've developed your soil to the point that it has all of that nutrition, then you don't need fertilizer at all. But if it's a relatively new bed, or you've just recently added amendments, or if it's an old bed that you haven't amended for a while, then yes, you probably should consider doing a little side dressing, a little fertilizer on top. A fertilizer that might be a little higher in phosphorus can benefit because we're trying to grow the root, and phosphorus tends to benefit the root more of the plant. I would stay away from nitrogen-rich fertilizers because the nitrogen tends to promote the stem and the leaf growth, and we really don't want a lot of stem and leaf growth on garlic because we're trying to build up the bulb. So you can consider adding a fertilizer mid-season. I wouldn't think more than once or twice at the outside that you need to fertilize your garlic if your soil hasn't been prepared, and then use a low nitrogen, higher phosphorus fertilizer, and that should be all that your plants need. So hopefully that helps out a little bit. My Chayla Sipes is saying, we were mulching the fruit trees last week, and my 4-year-old Linux, hello Linux, was pushing the wheelbarrow around, helping, and said, I'm Gardener Scott. That is awesome. You just made my week. That is incredible to have a 4-year-old pushing a wheelbarrow and thinking that Lennox is now Gardener Scott. That's incredible. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I think kids in the garden, and those of you that have been watching for a while know I say this on a regular basis, like kids in the garden makes gardening not only special for them, but special for us as well. And if you can start them that early where they're excited, oh, that's just incredible. I'm impressed. I'm really impressed. Okay. Ancient Gardening says we role play our heroes. Thank you. I don't think of myself as a hero, but that role playing is a nice idea. That's great. Thomas Bates says, when my tap water is extremely high pH, how to lower it? And so that's a good question. And actually the opposite holds true too. A lot of people will collect rainwater, and there's a lot of rainwater that can be quite acidic. But some of the studies that I've read, university research, trying to determine the effect of water pH on soil, show that it really has minimal and pretty much no effect whatsoever. And this is evidenced in a lot of areas where the soil is alkaline and the rain is acidic and the pH stays alkaline. You can add a high pH water to a low pH soil, and it's really not going to change it much at all. So the reading I've done and just my own experience has shown that the water pH, it dissipates so quickly throughout the soil and really won't cause any long-term change unless you're dealing with an area where you've got a boggy soil, and so you've got acidic water that can generate acidic soil as the plants die and break down, and that's basically what a bog is, and swamps are. They can be very acidic, and that's why, at least in the United States, so much of our soil on the east part of the country is more acidic because it's wetter, and that is partly based on that water staying in the soil. But as far as watering your pots, watering your beds, it really doesn't have much impact at all, the pH of your water. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. John is saying, Gardener Scott, being here in Aurora, Colorado, I planted garlic last fall. It's coming up beautifully. How long should I wait before harvesting? You've got some months to go. My garlic is coming up great. I was just looking at it yesterday, watered it yesterday. And usually here in Colorado now, in Aurora, you're a little bit lower altitude than I am, so you're a little bit warmer than I am. I harvest my garlic usually in July. And so you might be harvesting your garlic in late June, early July. Let the garlic tell you. And I've got two different videos where I talk about harvesting garlic and how you look at the leaves. When those outer leaves start to dry out and fall, that's your indication that it's time to start thinking about harvesting the garlic. And you can always dig up one of the bulbs and see if it's big enough, and that'll also determine when it's time to harvest your garlic. But a couple months to go, and this is a good opportunity to learn more about exactly what you're looking for, and you can watch those videos if you haven't seen them, because you've got time for the garlic to grow and develop, and just wait to harvest. So, Ace Anom, thank you so much for that contribution. I really appreciate that. And Patrick just gave one as well. I thank you for that as well. On this computer, things are scrolling, so I have to roll back up a little bit and see what Pat said. Do you have a recommendation to increase and attract snipe population? That's a good one. I'm actually going to touch a little bit on that video here when we get to the philosophy phase, but for those of you that didn't see my April Fool's video this week, it was about the hunting of snipe in the garden. And for those of you that might be from another country or not fully understand the concept of April Fool's Day in the United States, it's a day for pranks. And so my April Fool's videos are prank videos, not intended to be actual gardening advice, but I do have fun making them. And so the way to increase actual snipe population, snipe is a real bird. It's a shorebird. So if you want to increase the snipe population in your garden, you need to move to the coast and garden right there next to the water, and you might actually have some real snipe in your garden. But that's a humorous question for a humorous video. The rest of us can take our friends and family, usually young kids, out snipe hunting, but they really don't exist in the garden. And I know there were a few that weren't American and thought it really was done in all seriousness. So it was April Fool's. Dudist Priest, thank you for that super chat contribution. That's nice, thank you. First year with a raised bed that I built and filled in the fall. Awesome. Planted last week, and this week noticed fire ants going under the bed. Suggestions. So fire ants are one of those things that luckily I don't have problems here. In Oklahoma, we had some problems with fire ants. You can do everything you can to disrupt the fire ants. And so there's a lot of home remedies. I read a recent research paper on home remedies for fire ants, and almost all of them were ineffective. Many of them were completely ineffective, no results at all. The best results in this study that I read was boiling water. So if you can find the mound and pour boiling water into the mound, it's about 50% effective at killing the fire ants and destroying the colony. Honestly, I'm not a big fan of chemicals in the garden, but chemicals really are the best way to deal with fire ants, because you can try the home remedies, you can sprinkle vinegar around your beds to disrupt their pathways and maybe try to redirect them someplace else. There's all types of things like that. Boric acid can work. You can pour that around your beds and that can disrupt the normal flow of the ants. You can be vigilant, and every time you see an ant path develop, get out there and rake up the soil, add some mulch, and try to just keep them away from your garden, because they'll follow the path. They're leaving their little pheromones behind, and that chemical trail is what the other ants will follow. So if you can disrupt that chemical trail, you can reduce the numbers in your garden. But if you're trying to get rid of fire ants, it's almost has to be a chemical approach. And there's a lot of information out there if you do some searches on getting fire ants. And I have no doubt in your area, there are many companies that would be glad to come out and have you pay them. But I think most of us can deal with it at home if you just target the pesticide that you're using, the insecticide. If you get a targeted ant insecticide, you should be able to deal with the fire ants and not harm the other insects that many of us think are beneficial in the garden. And there you go. And Big B, the fluffy redneck, says, it's annoying that fire ants are in the U.S. They're an invasive species. You really need to use poisons to kill them. There you go. And that's just the simple truth. You can try to be as organic as possible, but fire ants are just one of those things that they're terrible. They're absolutely terrible, and you have to take terrible precautions to really deal with them. Andrea Adshead Newbie says, which is best to use over a raised bed in a polytunnel, plastic or fleece for cold weather snap? Good question. And it depends on how big the snap is and how much protection you want. And it depends on how thick the plastic is, and it depends on how thick the fleece is. And so I think the fact sheet is still out there. The Extension Service through Colorado State University has some good fact sheets on cold weather protection of plants, and they compare some of that. And I remember learning this almost 20 years ago in my Master Gardener training. And so a fleece line protection, like a row cover, will generally get you 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit extra protection over hoops. Plastic, generally, and again, it depends on the thickness of the plastic, but plastic generally will get you 3 to 5 degrees of extra protection over your plants. And so if it's just a cold snap that's going to be just touching on frosting temperatures, a fleece row cover should be good enough, just as plastic will be good enough. You can combine them. And so I will cover some of my hoops with the fleece cover to keep the insects out when those seedlings are just emerging, and to give that extra couple degrees of protection. And then if a cold snap threatens, then I'll come back and throw plastic over that for a day or two, and that's often enough as well. So if you can get 2 to 3 degrees of a fabric and 3 to 5 degrees with plastic, and that's cumulative. So with the fleece and the plastic, you might get 5 to 8 degrees of protection because you've got a double cover over those hoops. So depends on how much you're protecting and why you're using the cover. And I would say if you've got one or the other, go for it. And then if you want to invest and buy the second, go for that too. I've got both, and I use both of them. So that's a good way to do it. I saw somebody pop up here. Who was that? So that was Prepper Chris, another contribution. Thank you for that. Yeah, diatomaceous earth is one of those things that can be beneficial for most insects. And diatomaceous earth can work on a fire ant pile or any of those other crawling insects. I love diatomaceous earth. The biggest issue with the diatomaceous earth is that when it rains, it loses all of its properties. It becomes part of the soil and it no longer works right. And so if you're watering or raining anywhere near the pile or where you put your diatomaceous earth, you're going to have to put more of it on a regular basis. But that can be a pretty good organic way to deal with a lot of those pests. Okay, let's see what we have here. Let's see, DTE on aphids. I haven't used that. Kim Ye, Small Garden Dream, is saying. So I'll have to look into a little bit about that. Don't know much about that. Rachel McGraw is saying, I had to use plastic and fleece together last week when the temps dropped to 20 Fahrenheit for 2 days. The plants did well. There you go. A double protection really can make a big difference. And like I said, I'm going to be putting plastic over the seeds I planted probably in a couple days. The temperatures are going to drop a little bit, but with the heat today, and that's one of those things that I also wanted to start talking about, so I might as well jump into it right now. When we start looking at our spring planting and our spring sowing, we should also be looking at the season extension, how we're going to keep our plants warm and how we're going to warm our soil. And so I'm doing that. A number of you have obviously been doing that as well. And it's a great way to extend your season. But you have to be careful. Again, it's falling into that false situation where you're thinking, I've covered my plants and that's all I need to do, and now they're going to be nice and warm. Well, if I covered my plants yesterday, which I could have easily done, the seeds, now I'm going to talk as though they're plants. If I covered my plants yesterday, they're actively growing. Today, with 80 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to get hot inside that area, possibly too hot for those plants. The soil is going to dry out, the plants are going to wilt, and very small seedlings that wilt can result in death for those seedlings. And so as you're trying out some of these methods or doing the methods that you've been doing for years, where you're adding a cloth fabric, you're adding plastic, you're trying to warm up the soil, you're trying to keep your plants warm, you have to anticipate those hot days. And so it's not put the cover over and walk away. You need to anticipate that temperature increase is primarily at night. The soil's warming up during the day. That radiant heat from the soil as the night cools goes into the air around the plant. And if you can capture that air with the fabric or the plastic, you can keep the environment around the plant warmer, which means increasing the air temperature by 3 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit around that plant. During the day, you're doing the same thing. If you have the plastic over, the soil is warming. Well, now as that warm soil begins to release some of that heat into the air, there's nowhere for that heat to go. And so it's the greenhouse effect. It's heat building on heat, building on heat, and you can easily fry those little seedlings underneath plastic. So by all means, use a protective cover to get the warmth, to protect your plants, but that's primarily a nighttime or for those cold snaps where you're keeping them covered during the day to keep the plants warm. But all the rest of the time, during the sunny days, go ahead and pull the plastic off. You can roll it up, you can clamp it like I do at the top so there's airflow and it doesn't get too warm. And then later in the day, before the sun sets, you put the plastic back over it to help hold that heat going into the night. So experiment, see how you like to do it, but that's one reason I think why some people don't cover their plants with plastic, because you've got to get out and undo the plastic every day that it's sunny, and then put the plastic back in place at night, and then uncover it and cover it, and it does add extra effort, but it gives you an extra couple weeks in your growing season. And so it's the trade-off. Do you want to do that extra daily work to keep the heat at a manageable level so that you can get the plants growing sooner and maybe get an entire extra harvest during the year? So something to think about as you're experimenting and trying out the covers over your plants. If it's new to you, do be aware that you can overdo it by putting too much cover and too much heat on those plants. Okay, let's see. Ancient Gardening, you're quite active today. Sometimes we let the plants get too hot, cold, and some of them wilt, but they are plentiful. And that's another reason to plant a lot of plants. Most plants can recover from wilting without any problem. It's just those really young plants that haven't developed the ability to recover from wilting, and you may lose some. And as long as you've got more plants to put in, more seeds to put in, that's a great learning experience to figure it all out. Okay, let's see. Flora Filled said, appreciate your content, Gardener Scott. Well, thank you, Flora Filled. Try to put out what people need as much as possible. And just did the 259th video. And so they're continuing to crank out. And so I know a lot of you watch my videos and you've seen at least one to know that you're here. And I've got all those hundreds of videos. That's not even counting the live streams that we're doing. And we've been doing this now for over a year. There's a lot of information out there, but I continue to get comments from long-term viewers that say something like, oh, welcome back, haven't seen you in a while. Oh, there's a new video. And I'm putting out last week I put out 3 videos in addition to the live stream. This week I'll do 2 videos in addition to the live stream. And there are a lot of you that don't know that because you're not being notified by YouTube that one of my videos is coming out. So I'm always trying to do content that's appropriate for the season that I happen to be growing in. And then I'll put out content that I think is appropriate year round. But if you haven't subscribed, you won't be notified. And if you've subscribed, but you haven't clicked on that bell to be notified when new videos come out, then you might not be notified. And so it would be great if you subscribe if you haven't already. It would be great if you click on the bell if you haven't already, but you don't have to do that. Just know that I have videos coming out every week. And so if you're looking for more gardening information, whether you've subscribed or not, or clicked the bell or not, you can always find videos on my channel. And that'll help keep you in the know and have all the up-to-date information as I'm making it. And so the video that I just did this weekend was on sun mapping. And that's one of those that I think is appropriate year-round. All of us should map the sun in our garden. And I think more importantly, depending on the plants we're growing, the shade. And so that's one of those videos that is appropriate year-round. And if you didn't get notified about it, you can go to my channel and check out the sun mapping video and maybe learn a little bit about some of the ways I've done it to figure out where to put my beds and what plants to grow based on the sun in the garden. Okay, let's see what else we have. Riverdale Gardens, good to see you here, River and Dale. I have used kelp meal in my pepper containers for a few years now. Any thoughts on this? I think it's great. Kelp has some of those minerals and nutrients that are hard to get in or from other sources. And so if you've got access to the kelp, by all means, continue using the kelp because it really can be beneficial. Like most amendments, you can overdo it a little bit. And so I like to have a balance. And so kelp is great, but I would also say use compost and aged manure and worm castings and whatever you have access to. Just try not to be too reliant on kelp because kelp doesn't have everything that the plants need, and you need to get that balance of other nutrients from other sources. But it's great as an organic amendment, so good to see. Jay Dixon says, Gardener Scott, occasionally YouTube messes up subscriptions and notifications, and users should know that too. And that's true. and YouTube is a business, and they're trying to match videos up to the viewer. And it's possible that even if you have subscribed to me and you have clicked on notification, I might release a video that YouTube doesn't think matches your viewer style for whatever reason. It might be just the subject matter, it might be the keywords, based on your history. Even if you have subscribed and clicked on notification, YouTube mixes things up and they determine whether a video is appropriate for you or not, as far as when they suggest it or when they recommend it. And that's why I say, just if you get in the habit of just going to my Gardener Scott channel homepage, you might see a whole bunch of videos there you never even knew existed because YouTube didn't think you were interested for whatever reason. And you might not be interested, but I think there's a lot of stuff that you might be interested. So go ahead and check that out. Okay, Melissa Sullivan says, hardy, as in if they outgrow their pot, it gives them stability when you transplant, not cold hardy. And interesting, that's a good way to talk about it. So when we talk about hardy plants and cold hardy plants, it does mean different things to different gardeners and for different plants. And so cold hardy plants are those that if they get a frost, it's not going to be a big deal whatsoever. There's a lot of hardy plants out there that will do well in the garden. They might outgrow their pot and they get exposed to conditions they're not used to and they'll suffer. Or some of the hardiest plants that I've ever encountered are plants like rhubarb. You can't kill a rhubarb. I've had rhubarb growing in pots and then forgotten about the pots and come back a year later and with no water, no fertilizer, no attention whatsoever, the rhubarb is still growing in that pot. And that's a hardy plant, and it's also a cold hardy plant. So get to know your plants up close and personal, and you can decide which ones you like as hardy plants and cold hardy plants, and then match it all with your garden. So, okay. Let's see, Jenny Simon says YouTube's just evil now. They program the AI to keep you distracted with total nonsense. You've seen the trending section. Yeah, I occasionally go to the trending section. So it was a year ago, just over a year ago, that YouTube actually selected me as a creator on the rise. And so for 24 hours, I was on the trending tab for YouTube. And Scott Head, who we talked about often, and he was on the live stream a few months ago. They did the same thing with him a few months back, where the Scott Head Black Gumbo channel was a channel that was creator on the rise, and he was highlighted for 24 hours. So I'll go to the trending tab just to see if there might be other gardening channels that have been identified as creator on the rise. That day was a huge boost. They pushed some of my videos out to millions and millions of viewers, and millions of viewers weren't interested because we all look at the trending tab for different reasons. But some of you may have actually discovered my channel because it was on trending, but I have the same issue. It amazes me, some of the videos that they push to me. And it's like, why would I be interested in that? And then there's other videos I discover, and it's like, why didn't they push that to me? And I stopped trying to figure out the algorithm of YouTube long ago. Those of us that are creators, that are making videos, have a couple choices. You can try to chase the algorithm and make those videos that are going to become viral, that you know are going to be popular, or you can do like I do, which is just produce content, good content, wait for the viewer to find it, and when you find it, I hope you stick around and watch other content. I'm not trying to chase the AI or the algorithm. I think it's crazy because it makes no sense sometimes. So Big B, the Fluffy Redneck, is asking, what's your favorite seed companies? Have your opinions changed from your video you did on the subject? And so overall, I would say my opinions are the same. I have some favorite companies. I'm always discovering new ones. Botanical Interests this year is really rising on my list of favorite seed companies. And I was going to do a video and then decided I'll save it for next year. So I've done videos on the best seed catalogs, I've done the videos on seed companies. I've done videos where I unbox my seeds and tell you which ones I get and what I like. And then I've got this video planned for the winter time when we're looking at seeds again to talk about the best seed packets. And what I find is my opinion changes, to get to your question, based on what I learn as I grow the seeds and as I move through the season. And so I've been starting a lot of seeds indoors. I started putting some more seeds outside, and I'm realizing that I appreciate seed companies that make it easy for me. And so while I love Baker Creek heirloom seeds because they've just got some really unique varieties, I can't take a Baker Creek seed packet and plant those seeds because it doesn't tell me how deep to plant them. It doesn't tell me spacing. It doesn't tell me a lot of basic information that I need to know to plant those seeds. So I need to get supplemental information from the website or the catalog, and I don't always want to do that. Whereas botanical interest is rising quickly, and in my opinion, it's just about the best seed packet that you can find. It's got information on the outside, but you can also unwrap it, and on the inside is additional information. And so as I discovered this week, and I've grown plants from botanical interest seeds in the past, but what I noticed and hadn't really observed before was that they talk about the soil temperature. And so as I'm putting some of these seeds in early spring when my soil temperature is still cool, they're one of the very few seed packages out there that tell me, hey, hold your horses. Don't put these seeds in too early. Wait until the soil warms up, which I think is great information. So they've really advanced. Seed Savers Exchange is always one of my favorites, and I get lots of good information from their seed packages. I like territorial seeds, but I've been getting fewer and fewer of them in the last year. I think their prices are a little more. I could find some things in other areas. So for the most part, yes, my opinions are very similar to the videos I've done on it, but there are new ones that are coming up, and so I'll highlight Seed Savers Exchange and Botanical Interests as a couple of new companies that I'm really enjoying their product and enjoying how easy they make it for me to get out and put the seeds in the ground. Okay, Heidi Clark says, I look for what seed I need or unusual varieties that I've never seen before and buy from that company. And I'll do that too. I'll do a search of a particular variety, or many of you have suggested varieties, and I'll look for that variety. And often, especially if it's a unique seed, you can't find it at more than one or two sites. And so if I find it at a site, I'll buy it from that site. And so I've got some herb seeds, so like this one. So Strictly Medicinal Seeds. And so it's a really small company out of Oregon. It's organic, and they primarily are focused on herbs and medicinal plants, but I wanted to grow stinging nettle. And Strictly Medicinal Seeds was about the only place I could find stinging nettle seeds. So I bought from them. And I bought a few other things. Borage, I started some borage seeds yesterday. And so we'll see how it goes. I was impressed by their customer service and how quickly I got the seeds. And there's a new one. I don't know them well enough to necessarily recommend them, but they're the only ones that were selling the seeds I was looking for. So that's why I bought seeds from that company. That's just kind of the way it works. So, okay, let's bounce back a little bit to that idea of the seed packets and the soil and the concept of a false spring. And so what I really wanted to talk about when we talk about the false spring is just not being fooled. And I've been touching on this off and on now for the last hour, where you really have to get to know your garden. You really have to get to know the weather. You have to think about things like soil and the soil temperature and avoid being distracted by some of those outside influencers. And so I was out this weekend, very warm. The garden centers were overflowing with people preparing for the spring. Some of the stores are starting to sell plants, and it's really easy to be suckered into buying plants too early and putting them into the garden too early. And the result is often dead, dying, stunted, broken plants because you just didn't wait for the appropriate time. And I see this all the time at the big box stores where they're selling plants. And if you look at the plant tag will often give you the information just like a seed packet. And it will tell you that it's too early to plant in your area. But many people don't take the time to look at a plant tag until after they get home. They see the plant, they think, oh, I want to grow that plant. It's warm outside, and then you take it home. And it isn't until you decide that it's time to put it in your garden that if you look at the plant tag, you realize the time may not be right. If you don't look at the plant tag and put the plant into your ground, you may find out that the plant is going to suffer because the soil isn't ready yet. So my soil at 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit is okay for some of these seeds that I'm starting when I get the plastic protection over to help warm up the soil a little bit more. But that's way too cold for tomatoes and peppers and eggplants. And so even if the outside air temperature is warm enough, and if you add that plastic to boost the nighttime air temperature so that those plants stay warm enough, you got to think about the soil. That's the big lesson for today. Think about garden soil when you're putting your plants in the ground, because that is as important, maybe more important than the air temperature. We can manage our air temperature by putting that cloth and that plastic over our plants. It's more difficult to manage the soil temperature. And if the soil is too cold, the plants aren't going to grow. The seeds might not germinate. If they do grow, they're probably going to be stunted. And I've seen that over many years where, especially peppers, chilies, I'll put the plants in the ground a little too early before the soil has warmed, and those plants are stunted. That initial growth that I'm hoping for in the soil just doesn't happen. The roots try to grow and the soil's too cold and they don't grow, and the plant ends up being stunted for its entire life. So have patience, wait for all the conditions to be right. Don't be suckered in just because the store is selling you a plant. Get to know your plants, get to know your soil, get to know your garden, and figure out what works and what doesn't. And this gets back to the garden journal. When you put plants in, start adding that factor of your soil temperature. And as you track your plant, you can see how good it does or how bad it does. You might be able to draw a correlation to the soil temperature for next year when you do the same thing and start tracking all those different factors. And eventually you get to be an old grizzled gardener like me, and you've learned over the years that some of these things are more important than others, and that's when you can put your attention at, like for me here now, beginning of April, I can put my attention on soil temperature and decide what seeds I'm going to put in, and I'll continue to do that, taking soil readings. And as we get to the end of May, when I typically am putting in my tomatoes and peppers, I'll take a soil temperature again and see if they're ready. I ran into this problem at the school garden about 6 or 7 years ago. Very cold, very wet May, and the middle of May, end of May is when we put a lot of plants in the garden. It was a school. I wanted to show the kids how to transplant before they went on summer vacation, and we put plants into the ground while it was still too cold. And they suffered. We didn't have as big a harvest that year because I forced the effort of putting plants in before they were ready. That was intentional because it was an educational opportunity. But the plants don't know that. All they know is that they're being put in the ground too early, and it's wet, it's cold, and they're not going to do as well as they would otherwise if you just waited and did it the right way. But it's so hard because it's so warm and it's so nice and we want to get out there and do it. Just have patience. It'll happen. Don't worry too much about it. Okay. Kay Russell's saying, peppers and tomatoes definitely love warm soil. When they're transplanted, they do so much better. There you go. Another gardener speaking from experience, because it does make all the difference. Ancient Gardening saying peppers are not supposed to experience temps below 50 degrees. Absolutely not. Below 40 degrees. Absolutely. And as I've mentioned before in live streams and in my videos, I use 50 as my magic number. 50 degrees at night, assuming that the nighttime is the coldest part of the day. 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius. I don't even think about putting my peppers and tomatoes outside until I am regularly at that temperature at the coldest point of the day at night. And for me, that's typically in May. But you got to keep up with the forecast. You got to keep your eye on it. And even when the nighttime temperatures are reaching that 50 degree Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius range, if the soil hasn't warmed up to at least 60 degrees, the plants are going to suffer. And peppers prefer a soil 70 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit for best results. So the other thing I wanted to talk about, and I actually measured this for a future video in the garden, is what you can do to warm up your soil temperature in the spring. And so as I measured the soil in different areas of my garden, it was relatively consistent, just a few degrees different from those temperature readings in raised beds compared to those temperature readings in in-ground beds, with a major exception. And so in the areas where I measured that had a mulch in place, like the wood chip mulch I have in many areas of my garden, it really didn't matter if it was an in-ground bed or a raised bed. If it was mulched, they were warming at about the same rate. The raised bed started warming earlier, but once the soil thaws, they stay at about the same temperature. But where I saw my warmest soil was in an area where I had amended soil, so it was darker soil, and I did not have mulch on it. So that darker soil absorbs more heat during the day, which means the ground is absorbing and then holding on to that heat for a longer period of time. So the warmest soil in my garden right now is in the areas that are not mulched. And I love mulch, I encourage mulch, but in the springtime, as you think about germinating your seeds and as you think about putting your plants in, you might also want to think about pulling aside the mulch, removing it, and you might see this in some of my recent videos where in my vegetable garden you'll see that I don't have the straw on the beds anymore because I want the soil to warm up so that I can start germinating some of these seeds and getting them ready for the plants. And then once the seeds are growing and once the plants are in place, I'll put the mulch back. I had the mulch in place over the winter just to help protect the soil from the weather conditions, but to warm up your soil, pull back the mulch and it will warm up faster. So there's another little tidbit of information. PT Mana, I planted onions from small seedlings late summer last year. They grew through fall and lasted through winter with thick straw covering. Will they flower this year? Yeah, they probably will. You can expect once the temperatures start rising, if you leave some of those onions in the ground, they'll send up a nice flower stalk, they'll flower, and you'll get lots of seeds. It's a beautiful flower, and you'll get hundreds of seeds. I did that a couple years at the school garden, and just let an entire bed of the onions flower and seed, and we had more seeds than we could possibly deal with. And that bed and the beds nearby, because if you don't harvest, all the seeds are going to drop and they're going to spread in the wind. And we had onions in those beds for years afterwards because they just dropped and they germinated the following year. So onions are pretty durable seed and plant, and they'll last through some really cold conditions. And so I had some of those onion seed germinating in the raised beds the year after I let them seed. and there was still snow on the ground, and those onion seeds were germinating and growing. So yeah, I say let some of them grow and save some of the seed. And onion seeds don't last a long time in storage, and so you will need to do that on a regular basis. If you want to grow an heirloom variety of onion, you should pretty much have some onions going to seed every single year. Officially, when you see a recommended list, onion seeds last 1 year, maybe 2 in storage. And so if you're saving your seed, your onion seed in particular, and it doesn't germinate, that's why. It's just one of those seeds that doesn't store well. So every year, let some of your onions go to seed. It will take till the next season for you to collect that seed, but let them overwinter, just like carrots and those other biennial plants. Okay, let's see what we have. Jay Dixon's giving Scott Head's Black Gumbo growing potatoes in pot link. That's good. Thanks for sharing that, Jay. And I'm going to be, I've ordered potatoes. I think I've got 3 or 4 different varieties of potatoes that I ordered. They haven't arrived yet. I'm hoping I'll be able to start potatoes of my own here in a couple weeks. Scott's down in Texas, and he can do everything much earlier than I can. But I'm going to be watching Tony O'Neill's videos from Simplified Gardening. Scott Head's got some good stuff as well. And then I'll be adding my own to the mix, hopefully here as soon as I can get my tomatoes and start getting them in the ground. Okay, let's see what else we have. Let me scroll back up a little bit to see what I was missing. Talking about great information. Simplified gardening. Oh, there you go. Jay has also gave the link to Simplified Gardening potatoes videos. That's awesome. I had missed that comment, so I'm glad that you mentioned that, because Tony's got some great videos, and as I've said before, I like Scott's videos as well. Claudia's saying, I've been seeing lettuce here and there because of the wind blowing the seed salad everywhere. And that's one of those reasons. In fact, I noticed that. So if you saw my video on saving spinach seeds that I did a couple weeks ago, I was out in the garden yesterday watering, and I'll be talking about that here in just a second. But I've got spinach popping up from those spinach seeds that fell off the plant, from those spinach plants that I intentionally let bolt and go to seed last season. And so I did a video about growing the spinach, letting it flower, letting it go to seed, saving the seed. Well, now I've got spinach growing all around that bed, in the bed and outside the bed, from those extra seeds that just fell all over the place. And I really like doing that. I'm anticipating that I'll have turnips popping up here pretty soon, because I let my turnips go to seed last year. And I let my Napa cabbage go to seed last year. So I'm expecting a lot of plants to start popping up once the soil gets warm enough. And at least in my case, spinach is one of those that can germinate in really cold conditions. And so as cool as my soil is, it's warm enough for the spinach. And I'm looking forward to harvesting some of that from this last year's seeds. So let your plants go to flower. If you've got the space and you don't mind learning something, let your plants go to seed, and then you'll collect that seed, but much of it will fall to the ground. And so when it starts popping up, it's one of those little gifts that nature gives us when we have those extra things that start popping up. So, okay, so back to that other point I wanted to make. Try not to get too wrapped up to your normal way of doing things as well when we have a false spring situation. And so false spring, again, it's just like these warm days that I have. I know I've got at least 1, if not half a dozen more days of snow in the next 6 weeks until we get to my last frost date. And so this is just a short period of very warm weather. I do not expect that my spring is going to stay this warm for a couple more months. And that's why it's false, because it lulls us into that false sense of security that it's going to be warm and it's going to be nice. Well, the other side of it holds true as well. When you recognize that you have these really warm days, you've got to think about your garden. You've got to think about your plants, because normally I would still have snow on the ground right now. That snow would melt and it would help keep my soil moist underneath that wood chip mulch that I put in place over the winter. But partly because I've pulled away the mulch to warm up the soil, and now because of these really warm days, my soil is drying out. And a lot of the plants in my landscape that would normally have enough moisture right now, this time of year, they're not getting rain, they're not getting snow, they're just getting warm weather and hot temperatures. So you have to water your plants. You might need to water earlier than you're used to, and you might need to water more. And so a week ago, my garden hoses were frozen from the water that remained in those hoses over the winter. They're thawed out. I had to hook up the hoses to my faucet and get out there and water my fruit trees, water my fruit bushes, water my perennials, and water my beds that I haven't even put seeds in yet. Because, as you probably know, I'm a huge advocate of the life of soil. The soil life is decomposing that organic matter to make it available to your plants. That's one of the best things you can do in your garden, is have that soil life in that rich soil you're developing. Well, it's life. It needs water. So even when you don't have plants growing in those beds and you haven't put seeds in to germinate, you need to water your beds. You need to keep that soil moist. You need to keep that life alive. And too often we don't think about that in spring. And the fall spring just makes things worse, because if you haven't had the snow or the rain, your soil hasn't been moistened since whatever that time was. And snow may not give as much moisture as you think it does. So as soon as the conditions start warming up, get out there and water your plants. Water your lawn, water everything in your landscape, because they're starting to wake up. And when they wake up, they want to start growing. And when they start growing, they need moisture. And if you haven't watered your soil, then your plants are going to suffer right away, early in the season. And I've noticed some of my fruit trees have started to bud, and some of the buds are starting to break, and I can see green on a lot of these branches of my fruit trees. It's way too early, but it's happening. My plum tree is the first one to wake up, and it's awake. If I'm not out there this week with 80-degree temperatures, my fruit trees are going to suffer, because that soil is going to dry out pretty quickly. Get out there, water your soil. If there happens to be a plant in that soil, water it a little bit extra so that that plant can absorb the moisture that the soil organisms aren't using. And just keep that going. Just keep that cycle going throughout the season. Water your soil when it needs water, and your plants will end up growing better because you've been keeping your soil alive. Wayne Self, thank you so much for joining the community and becoming a member of the Gardener Scout community. It's good to have you here. Thanks so much. Trudy's Fun says, my garden has had about 500 millimeters of water over the past few weeks. Wow, that's a lot. That's it's about 10 inches, I think, over the past few weeks. So that's a lot of water. And mine only got what I gave it yesterday. So you got to stay active. You got to be involved. You got to get back there. Kiri's saying my strawberries and oregano are starting to come back already. I noticed my strawberries peeking up through the dried leaves yesterday as well. And Kiri lives just down the road from me, has the same weather conditions, and she's already out in the garden. She had the kids out in the garden this weekend, and improving the beds, looking at the plants, getting things ready to go. But those of us that are enjoying these warm temperatures should know that the cold is going to come back. So you can get things ready right now. If you water your plants and the cold comes again, don't forget to take the hose off of the faucets so that you don't have a break. And I've done that way too many times. I can't tell you how many times this time of year that I hooked up the hose like I did. I put my water wand on it to water the plants, left the water wand, left the hose hooked up to the faucet, came back the next day and either had a break in the hose, but most often had the head of my watering wand break because there was water left behind and it got below freezing overnight, and that little bit of ice is enough to damage hose and watering wands. So got to make sure you undo it. So I did that yesterday. Took everything apart, put it back in the garage to stay warm. Even though the forecast said it was supposed to be above freezing last night, I've just learned to just play it safe. If the nighttime temperature is anywhere close to freezing, I put my tools, especially those that have water in them, away so that I don't have that freeze damage. So just something to think about. Rachel, thank you for that. Remember to hit the thumbs up button before you go. I appreciate that. Always nice to have thumbs up on these videos. That's nice. And so let's move to that philosophy point, because it directly ties in to the thumbs up and the thumbs down. And so I'll tell you why I wanted to talk about this philosophy today as we get about it in here just a few more moments. And so the basic concept that I wanted to share with you today, and I say it in every video, is enjoy gardening. I think gardening can be so enjoyable. And so definitely enjoy gardening. But take that a step further and don't take gardening too seriously. And so when we're talking about too much heat or too much cold, and you got to put a cover on or take a cover off, and you got to put your watering wand away when it gets too cold at night, that's work. That's effort. And it's stuff that needs to be done. And it's stuff that we should treat seriously. Because if we don't take the watering wand off and it gets below freezing, now we've lost the head of that watering wand and we have to replace it. And then there's money involved and there's time and effort involved. So gardening is a serious activity. But don't take it too seriously. Relax. Enjoy it. Have a good time with gardening. And even when things go wrong, even when the times are bad, try to enjoy it as much as possible. And realize there are many more things in life that are more serious and potentially more important on a day-to-day basis. And so the reason I wanted to talk about that is because of the thumbs up and the thumbs down. And I think this is funny. We talked a little bit about the Snipe video at the beginning of this live stream. That was my April Fool's contribution last year. I did a video on how to grow spaghetti, tongue-in-cheek. It was just an opportunity to try to get some of you to smile. And I know many of you really enjoy those videos. And so the video this year on snipe hunting in the garden so that they can take care of your slugs, and the video last year on how to grow spaghetti, over the course of the year, those videos have gotten more comments, more positive comments than any other videos that I've done. So I know they're being greatly received, and I know many of you really appreciate it, and I love doing those, and you'll see many more on April Fool's Day in the days to come. But what I find surprising is in the last year, the two videos that have done the worst as far as thumbs down are those two videos. Most of my videos, I get a ton of thumbs up, occasional thumbs down. But last year's video on how to grow spaghetti and this year's video on snipe hunting in the garden were the worst videos in the entire year for people giving me a thumbs down on that video. Now, those of you here today, it probably boggles your mind to think that. And so I tried to do some analysis, tried to figure out what is it about those videos that people want to give a thumbs down to it when I think it's clearly fun and I'm doing it to bring a smile to your face. And what I find based on a few of the comments and trying to develop an understanding of my viewers is that there's a lot of gardeners out there that are looking for advice on how to garden. And when I do a video on how to grow spaghetti, even though it's tongue-in-cheek, it's a bit of a farce, they came to that to actually learn how to grow spaghetti. And then when they found out it was a joke, they were mad, gave a thumbs down, and maybe unsubscribed from the channel. And my message today is lighten up a little bit. Don't take gardening so seriously. that if you see a video that isn't what you were looking for, or maybe runs counter to how you think gardening should be, well, soak it in. Just gather that extra little bit of information and you might learn something from it. And more importantly, at least on April Fool's Day, you might get a smile to go with an otherwise hard day. And there's so many other things. It's not just my videos. I don't really worry that much about the thumbs down. I just find it interesting that I get more thumbs down on the videos that I'm trying to bring a smile to a gardener's face, and obviously having the opposite effect on a large number of viewers. So I certainly am not trying to generate a bad feeling among gardeners. I'm just trying to get you all thinking differently as to gardening and how you approach gardening. And I get other negative comments regularly when I say that I don't do no dig gardening because it doesn't match with my climate and my soil. Oh, the number of negative comments I get because they think that I'm some evil person who thinks Charles Dowding is terrible. Well, no, that's not at all. I just garden differently. And I want you to think about gardening from that perspective. We're all doing it differently. We all have different ways to convey our message. I'm serious most of the time, but there's a couple times I'm not. So give me a break, give everybody else a break. There are many other gardening channels out there on YouTube, and they'll present information, and it's not always the best information. It doesn't always agree with the way I do things. I'm not going to give them a thumbs down. I'm not going to unsubscribe from a channel. I'm not going to make my day a bad day just because somebody said something that I didn't agree with or that I wasn't expecting. And so that's where this philosophy for the day comes in, is to not take gardening and the messages that all of us gardeners are sharing with each other, don't take it too seriously. Sit back, relax, try to enjoy it as much as you can, and try to learn from the experience, even if it's an experience you don't agree with, even if it's an experience that doesn't make you smile, if it's an experience that annoys you. Try to figure out what is it about that bit of information that got that reaction from you. And you may realize that it's just me being silly on April Fool's Day, or you may realize that it's somebody else doing things differently in their garden because they have a different climate, or they have a different language, or they have a different way of doing things in gardening. We're global. We really are a global gardening community, and we're all doing it differently. So be accepting. Accept all of us in this community. Even when we're silly and we make a video and you were looking for something serious on how to kill the slugs in your garden, and instead you got a night vision camera trying to hunt snipe at night, well, don't let that get you down. Don't let that be a negative influence on how you garden. Find another video on how to deal with slugs in your garden and just keep learning. Just keep gardening. And as always, I'm Gardener Scott, and just keep enjoying gardening. I'll see you here next Monday. I look forward to fixing my problem and hopefully being back in the studio. Have a great gardening week. We'll see you then.